Broadcasting live from a boiler room, this is the Monstrous Feminine podcast, the film club where we dissect the eerie intersections of gender in horror. My name is Mila and I'm joined by my dreamers,
Louisa,
Tyia,
and Zeba.
This month we are talking about dreams and nightmares in horror. We will be covering the 1984 seminal horror film Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven, the 2021 horror mystery Last Night in Soho, directed by Edgar Wright, and the 2021 crime horror Malignant, directed by James Wan. Before we get into the film, go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcast app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast.
In Nightmare on Elm Street, a group of teenagers, Tina, Rod, Nancy, and Glenn, discover they are all experiencing the same nightmare of a man in a dirty striped sweater with knives for fingers. After Tina is sliced to death in her sleep, the group realizes that if this figure kills them in their dreams, they die in real life. One of the teens, Nancy, discovers the identity of the killer to be Freddy Krueger, a child murderer who was killed by the town's parents many years prior. Nancy decides to set traps and face Freddy's memory head on.
All day long I've been seeing that guy's weird face and hearing those fingernails.
Fingernails? That's amazing you saying that. That made me remember the dream I had last night.
What'd you dream?
I dreamed about a guy in a dirty red and green sweater.
Well, what about the fingernails?
Oh, he scraped his fingernails along things. Actually, they were more like finger knives or something he'd made himself. But they made a horrible sound. It's like, scream.
Nancy, you dreamed about the same creep I did.
That's impossible.
I want to hear about all your interesting dreams. And I'm talking, it can just be the scariest dream you've ever had, or it can be like if you've had any weird dream experiences like sleep paralysis or precognitive dreaming like deja vu or lucid dreaming or dream incorporation. Do you have any cool dream stories?
I don't remember my dreams that well, and I don't write them down. I will remember that I saw a person that I've never met in my dream before, and then I'll see someone in real life and be like, I'm pretty sure that's the same person that I randomly saw in my dream who I've never met.
You know how every person that you dream of is a face that you've actually seen? That's like apparently a dream fact, which I think is insane to me.
I dreamed a lot as a kid, but then I stopped dreaming when I started smoking weed, and I dream like once a year now. But when I do, it's always a lucid dream or sleep paralysis. So when I get sleep paralysis, it's usually like from a nap, like not a nighttime dream, like a weird time of the day dream, daylight hours. And my eyes are open. I'm usually sleeping on my back, which I don't normally sleep on my back. Maybe it's something about the position, but I wake up on my back.
It definitely is on your back. You're more prone to it.
Yeah, you're way more likely if you're on your back.
Oh, I didn't know that. So maybe I should stop napping on my back.
Wait, so this happens every time on your back and you've never made the connection?
I don't sleep on my back often. Anyway, well, here we are making the connections. Thank you, friends. And it'll feel like something's sitting on me, like a huge weight, or I'll see like a shadow moving in the room, but I don't see like any discernible figures. It's just shadows. And I was visiting my cousin last year in her apartment that I'd never been to, and I lucid dreamed in her house for the first time. And I got up to pee. I went to the bathroom, and the bathroom was like not as I remember it to be. It was like reversed mirror bathroom. But I was like, oh, I've never been in her apartment. Like maybe it's just like I'm misremembering how the bathroom was. And then I came out of the bathroom, and her roommates were there. And speaking of like not seeing faces you haven't seen before, I just assume these are her roommates because I met them once in passing. And I'm like, I don't really remember what these white girls look like. And then there's also like a guy with them. And I checked the clock before I went to the bathroom. It was like 6 or 5 in the morning. So it was still kind of dark. And I was like, oh, they must be coming back from like partying or something like that. And I like wave at them on my way back to my cousin's room. And they all stare at me. Like nobody says hello. Nobody waves. They're just like staring at me really hard. I was like, that's odd. And then I go back to my cousin's room. We're sleeping in the same bed. I crawl back in. I wake up again at like 10 a.m. and I really had to pee. So I was like, fuck, did I actually pee 3 hours ago or whatever it was? So either that was a dream, but it felt like very, very real. Like I was very much walking through her apartment. I don't know the floor plan of her apartment well enough to have dreamt it in such detail. So maybe I was sleepwalking or something. I don't know. But all this to say, when I do dream, it's like never normal any longer. And I don't dream typically ever beyond like horrible, out of my control experiences.
I mean, that sounded like Inception, where they're all like looking at you.
I've never seen Inception. I should watch it.
So if you only have dreams like a few times a year, have you had the dreams where you dream that you have a baby and then you wake up and you feel like the emptiness?
I don't feel emptiness. I feel relief. You feel empty? Okay, that's a different psychology. We don't need to read into that.
Like I've had a dream where like I've had a kid and the kid has like aged some in the dream, like from like newborn to like 3 months or something. And I'm like, but I spent time with the baby and now it doesn't exist.
That's really sweet. I feel like I don't usually have the baby. I usually just have pregnancy dreams, and those are like anxiety.
See, that's like when you have the actual baby and like you hold it in your dream, then you're like you feel like this emptiness of like the absence of motherhood or something, or like I don't know. It's very strange.
Is that a recurring dream that you have?
No, I've had them like every once in a while, usually like when I'm ovulating, honestly.
So, in other words, recurring.
But not always monthly. Like I've only had one this year, and then like last year I think I had maybe 2 or 3.
That's crazy. I mean, maybe I take it back when I say relief, because I meant to say I feel relief at not being pregnant, but I've never had the baby.
I haven't, not in birth. It's like I already have the kid, not like in labor. Like that would be terrifying.
I don't really remember my dreams. I've definitely had like nightmares. I do dream, I just like forget in the morning. And then when I was younger, I would lucid dream quite a lot and probably have more vivid dreams. And then more recently, I don't remember them. I don't think this is sleep paralysis because I can move and I do move. I sleepwalk, I sleep talk. It's just because, Zeba, when you were describing it as like seeing figures in the room, like I get that if I'm very stressed, I will see. It's very frustrating because I can never it never becomes clear to me what's in my room, or like I just have this like urgent sense that something needs to be done, a task, I need to like confront something, and then I'll wake up with this like overwhelming anxiety about it, but I don't remember exactly what it is. But it's like a sort of weird deja vu. I'm like, I can remember it in the past feeling the same thing, where I'll like wake up standing in my room, and I've often like been grabbing clothes and like putting them to a different spot. Do you know what I mean? Like I've done something in my sleep and I'm like wake up halfway through and I'm like, what was I doing here? There's some like deep subconscious either fear or like something it's just like feels like a practical like to-do list that I can't access, that's like really deep in my subconscious. It really annoys me because I sort of like half remember as I'm waking up and then it's gone by the time I'm like fully awake.
But now that we live together, if you sleepwalk around me, that will freak me out so badly.
I once screamed in my sleep when I was staying for the first night sharing a room with someone on like a workaway holiday. I think I've said this on the podcast before, and she was like, "You screamed in your sleep last night," and I was like, "Cool, nice to meet you."
My scariest dream was also when I had sleep paralysis, the one time I've had it. And for listeners who don't know, sleep paralysis is when your brain during REM in essence paralyzes you and makes it so you can't move. And something happens. It's usually when you're sleeping on your back or you have some interruption to your sleep cycle in some way. So I was jet lagged, which is why it happened. But you basically can hallucinate while being kind of half awake and conscious of things. So you'll like be in your room, but you'll be paralyzed, and the feeling of your body being kind of frozen is like a weight on your chest, and it is terrifying. And many people hallucinate like little demons or something sitting on their chest. For me, I started by dreaming about a man. My demons are men. Like a man just attacking me in the park. And I like woke up, but I couldn't move, and I could still feel the person on my chest. I didn't actually visually hallucinate, and if I had, I wouldn't have known any, like, what was reality and what wasn't. But because I didn't hallucinate, I was like, I must be dreaming. Then eventually, like, I could move again and, like, slowly got feeling back. But that was the scariest because it felt so real. And I think that dreams and horror are an interesting marriage because I just don't like the idea of, like, this realm that we enter in the subconscious and, like, what gets explored in our subconscious. And there are people who believe it's, like, foretelling of future things or, like, dream meanings and dream interpretations and all these different things. And I think it's all very interesting. So I was interested in dreams as a horror theme.
I think it also like distorts the concept of reality because, for example, if you dream that you've had a child and your body's pumping out oxytocin and you wake up with this like emotional bond to something that doesn't exist, like I think that's pretty scary. Like the idea that your feelings like can shape and warp your reality, but you haven't had the actual experience. That freaks me out quite a lot.
Yes. That particular instance of sleep paralysis just showed me like how fragile our perception of reality basically is, because I was like, if I had just hallucinated something, I would have thought it was real. But because I didn't in that instance, I knew it was a dream. But I was like, we really don't know. Like, this is why witness reports to crimes are so unreliable, because we just don't know anything. But it's interesting. And then the reason why people sleepwalk is because your brain doesn't effectively paralyze you like it's supposed to. And I think that's also interesting.
The Monstrous Feminine is on Spotify, so please go rate us 5 stars and leave us a comment. If you do engage with our content, you might just get a shout out in our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode, our Witch of the Week, is Amy, who commented on our Perfect Blue Film Cell horror episode and said, I love hearing your takes on horror movies, and I'm so glad y'all decided to cover Perfect Blue. I feel like I need to rewatch it now with the film cell lens. Thank you so much, Amy, for commenting this and for interacting with us on Spotify. For those of you who haven't noticed, Spotify has like a new update where you can leave comments and you can leave them directly on the episode so that we can see them and we can interact with them and respond to them as well. Amy left one on the Perfect Blue episode and we really enjoyed seeing that. That was one of our favorite episodes to record because it had been a film that we have been wanting to do for a really long time. So thank you so much, Amy. Hope you're having some amazing weather, having some nice like desserts and great things come your way.
I hope your April was full of rain and that your May will be full of flowers.
Friendly reminder that we're also on Patreon and Substack, and you can find all of our links and information on our social media. Please support us. Any contribution helps.
Do you guys like Nightmare on Elm Street?
This is the first classic I've actually thoroughly enjoyed.
The first? I thought we quite enjoyed, Suspiria is a classic, and you enjoyed that.
I'm talking more like that sort of next generation of franchised horrors, not like the old Italian.
Do you not like Halloween?
Absolutely not. Halloween was so dull to me.
Okay.
I agree. I think of the like horror films that people think of when they think of horror, which is like Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. I think Nightmare on Elm Street is the only one that I like truly enjoy. I don't think you can do dreams as a theme without doing Nightmare on Elm Street as like the dream film. But I do think it's interesting when you look at the canon of dreams and films about dreams, in that I think Nightmare on Elm Street is probably the strongest one in like the whole kind of list. For me, it seems like it would be really like fertile ground for lots of like really interesting horrors, but sometimes they're just not quite hitting the mark. An interesting thing is like even before, so just before Nightmare on Elm Street, which is 1984, there were a few from like 1980, Altered States, The Sender in 1982, The Slayer in 1982, and then all in the same year as Nightmare on Elm Street, you had Dreamscape and The Initiation. And then also in like the late 80s, there's like Prince of Darkness, The Dreaming, Dream Demon, Beyond Dream's Door. This seems to be like this really like cluster of like dream horror around the same time. And I think part of that is because of the success of Nightmare on Elm Street. Like obviously people are going to like rush to like copycat in the same way that publishing always rushes to copycat. But it's also just interesting when you think of it as like the canon. Like I like to look at these little horror timelines and think about what it says about society. And it's just interesting that there's like a huge concentration of them kind of in like the 80s of like horrors about dreams. And I'm like, what in our collective subconscious was everybody so afraid of, you know? I know that's like super macro and you could apply that to like anything, but it is just like something to ponder. Yeah, I like to look at when certain themes arise. Like it kind of looks like in the latter half of like the 2000, like nearing 2020, nearing around like 3 years before, and now 3 years out, we have another like kind of explosion of like dream related horrors. So I'm like, it's interesting. It's like, I wonder like what we're repressing as a collective consciousness, at least in like a lot of these like American or British films, that's like coming to the surface through our art about dreams.
I don't think I'd realized until you mentioned that actually like the canon of dream horror is like comparing it to when we did folk horror, and we just felt like we had this sort of endless list of really prominent and interesting films that we all wanted to do. For dream horror, it feels like I do wonder like why it's maybe more difficult to like get it right. Maybe because it's like in a sense, like quite a cliche. Any kind of like story around the idea of a dream, because there's that like cliche about like, and they woke up and it was all the dream. And there's a little like cheesiness to it, maybe, and a little bit, it feels on the nose to kind of play around with a little trite, like warped perceptions and dreams melting into reality. Like maybe, I mean, we have Inception, and I know it's not a horror, but like that was so hugely successful, probably because it had like, I mean, Nolan behind it, so it had like an added sort of gravitas to it as like a distinguished filmmaker, and it didn't take the same approach as like Nightmare on Elm Street, which I think has a great balance of like it being genuinely scary, like the premise of it, and also like the special effects. Like I think especially at its time, like it would have been like fucking terrifying to watch, but also like it doesn't take itself too seriously. I think it balances those two things well, but then probably most films don't get that balance right. You either have to be quite super serious like Inception, or you have to like play around with it a bit more. But yeah, I liked this film. I thought it was not just like I was appreciating it from quite like a sort of like critical standpoint, like I also was enjoying the film. And yeah, especially the creativity with special effects.
I love me some 80s special effects. Give me some tangible goo. Give me someone's face coming off their skull.
I don't know about like necessarily, you know, you said there's sort of like clusters of dream horror that like you can pinpoint certain decades. I wonder how much is also like stylistic trends that influence it. There's always like a mix of deep embedded subconscious fears in society, but I don't know how tidily that is reflected in media. Like it doesn't, you know, it's not happening as these fears are being expressed. Like it obviously happens like a few years after.
What are we scared of? I should say as well with the canon, though, I forgot to mention that I only included films which were specifically about dreams, like where dreams were a big part of the plot. I have not included any old horror which has a dream sequence or nightmare, because that is basically every fucking horror. Like, if you think about how many people like wake up in a fright, even Carrie, like the end of Carrie, where there's like a quick like little dream jump scare, or Friday the 13th. So I didn't include like those films. So if you actually look at like horror films or films about nightmares, it's not a huge canon. And like you said, it's mostly dominated by Nightmare on Elm Street, which is why we had to do it.
Agree that the reason not a lot of these work is the cliche of dreaming, like, oh, it's so expected. But I will say, I do think there's huge missed opportunity for using dream logic, because a lot of people dream in the same way, and a filmmaker being able to understand and utilize dream logic and play off of that familiarity that is like shared among people. I think that's why Inception works, because I was describing my lucid dreaming or sleepwalking to Mila, and Mila's like, yeah, that's exactly how lucid dreaming and sleepwalking works, because I guess there are like patterns to it. There are like ways that these things play out, and dream logic is like, oh, you are only going to see people you know, or like if the dream people look at you, that's bad, or if you're flying, you should, I don't know. There are like rules to it in the same way that horror has like rules to it, even though you can break them. And what would be scary is like breaking the dream logic. Like, oh, I understand how a dream works. And then if the dream does something unexpected, like in this movie where if you die in the dream, you die in real life, like that's the unexpected twist that breaks the dream logic. So in the same way that like the horror canon has all these like rules, like a child's not supposed to die, or when you have sex, you die. Like, all of those things happen in this, but that's because it's like a classic. But being able to break those rules is really like jarring to people, and that's where the jump scares, the unexpected thing comes in. Like, it is a shame to me that like more movies haven't utilized the shared dream experience or dream psychology. I don't know if there's any science, if we figured out like why there are those like shared things in our brains about
We
dreaming.
haven't figured out exactly why. There are lots of theories. We don't know why exactly we dream.
Yeah, or why we dream in the way that we do, but like I think that this franchise does it well to a certain point. Like, eventually it does go off the rails, obviously they all do, but like they've broken every rule. They have to like make up new rules to break by the time you get to like the deep sequels. But I guess, yeah, like a plot twist like the end of Carrie, or like waking up from a dream, that can be done well. But I think in a movie that isn't about dreams, that like takes away the scare factor, because you're like, oh, it was just a dream.
If anything, they do the opposite in this film. They're like, oh no, it's still a dream.
Yeah. Or the fear of falling asleep is a really good one to me. Like, that's the thing that stresses me out about these movies, is like her drinking all the coffee and like trying to stay up in the sleep deprivation and not knowing when she's dozed off versus when like something else is going on. I think that works really, really well in all of these movies. Because it's such a classic, no one else can do the fear of dozing off after this without it being a reference to this film. So like, kudos to that. I think it's cool, but I'm just like, it's like frustrating that it's like cornball forever after, I guess.
I think what makes this movie scary particularly is like the fact that the dream doesn't really end. It's kind of like, usually in horror movies, I think like Louisa was saying, you have the moment where someone wakes up and they're like sweaty, and there's like the relief of, you know, it's not really happening. And then you're like, oh, okay, that didn't happen. But in this movie, it's kind of like the entire time you're questioning, okay, is this real? Is this a dream? Is this happening now? The complete framework of what normally happens with a dream in horror movies like shaken up into something else. I'm not shocked that all the dream horror films were made afterwards, because they kind of did the same thing with the race horror with Get Out.
Well, that's hard because it's like you can't franchise like the horror of racism like that. I don't know why anyone thought that they could do Get Out again.
So many people have tried and continue to try, and it's exhausting. But this works really well because I think like it sort of makes you doubt reality in a way. And then you're also like stressed the entire time watching it, because there's no way to really logically explain what's happening. Because it's like explaining that something is happening in a dream, and so therefore it's happening in real life, and that some guy in the dreams is the one killing these people, and so the person is falsely imprisoned, is very scary. And I think having the main character be a woman in this movie, and honestly in all the movies that we're going to cover on in dreams, is really interesting, because I think there's a reoccurring theme of having a female main character and no one around her believes her, and they make the characters start to doubt their reality. We see it in Malignant, which we're going to do later. It also happens in Last Night in Soho. So I think there's sort of an underlying commentary on how easy it is for people to dismiss a woman's concerns or reality, because we're often just viewed as being like hysterical or like overly emotional or making things up in our heads. So having the main character be women in these scenarios really sort of feeds into like that fear of people doubting what your reality is, and also how you so often question it because people tell you something isn't a big deal that you think is a big deal, or like something that you think happened didn't happen. And so I don't know, I thought that was really interesting. I'm not sure if it was really aiming to do that, because this was the 80s and I realized they certainly weren't that progressive, but it is interesting that there's a reoccurring theme of female characters with their reality being doubted in these dreams.
There was this critic, James Kendrick, who in a essay called Razors in the Dreamscape, revisiting A Nightmare on Elm Street and the slasher film, They talk about how most horror films in America at this time were founded on some sort of rationality that, like, in some way explains the monstrosity, either through science gone wrong, and I'm reading here, like Frankenstein, or psychosis, which is taken to near parody through the end of Psycho, or the supernatural as mediated through religion. Thus, even though horror incorporates elements of surreal through monstrosity and abject terror, few films undercut the very idea of a rational explanation and hence the possibility of stopping evil. And in many ways, A Nightmare on Elm Street does precisely that by allowing the surreal to infiltrate the slasher plotting, introducing elements of the fantastical that can only be explained via dream logic that is inherently shifting, flexible, and imminently fleeting. Yeah, just to say that this is like one of the mainstream, I guess, American horror films that like introduce like a surreal element, and it's like you said, like it's scary because the dream doesn't end. It's scary because by using dream logic, it's like you can't really stop it. Like it's like, how can you defeat what is like a supernatural memory in everyone's collective subconscious? So I think probably that's contributing to the success of this film as well.
Yeah, I liked that quote. I think it summarized really well, Zeba, what you were mentioning about dream logic as a really great framework to kind of subvert like previous tropes or like find new ways to kind of like get under people's skin. We've done a lot of obviously like supernatural based horror. Like I'm rarely moved by supernatural horror or like religious horror. I feel like with dreams it gives like a little bit more of like a way to kind of bridge, like Louisa, you mentioned, like this sort of like rationale versus the unknown. And dreams have obviously been like extensively studied versus like, you know, scientists aren't as interested in like looking into the idea of ghosts or anything supernatural. But I think like dreams and our subconscious minds is something that's pretty unknown to us, because so often dreams like appear to us as nonsensical and fragmented, and within that dream logic, which isn't at all like reality, having that as a basis for horror, I think seems like a little bit more palatable to me to enjoy it, but also to like scare me a little bit more, because I'm like, shit, I mean, it couldn't happen. I couldn't be like killed by Freddy Krueger in a dream. It's a better like unknown to me. I don't know. I think it just like serves horror well. Like it's not, doesn't get too silly. And I know I said that like Nightmare on Elm Street, and you said the surrealist elements of like Freddy being kind of this like pantomime-y musical villain.
He's kind of it-ish in his motion.
Yes, he scuttles.
He scuttles, and he has those long arms. I love his long arms.
But even that like tongue phone scene, like this, like him, I'm your boyfriend now. Like I think it so expertly balances the humor with the like horror, and I think that's, I don't know, it did that so well. That's probably why I enjoyed it so much. And then obviously like I think it was like crafted in a really good way, and also we have a really great final girl. Like I really like the way they're characterized. Like they're obviously a victim of time in their writing, but I think it like, I don't know, it's just pretty ahead of her time. Like she's pretty crafty.
Yeah, she, that Home Alone booby traps.
I was gonna say it was like Home Alone. I think what you said is right, Mila. Like it leans. I think this film isn't afraid to lean into campy elements of itself. Like I think there's a self-consciousness to the silliness because it's a dream, and we know that dreams can be silly. It almost like permits this like element of play. It's silly, but also still scary. So Mila and I watched this together, and we were like, she says to her dad, like, come back in 20 minutes, and in that time I'll have like caught Freddy, right? And then she proceeded to do this whole sequence of setting up all the booby traps. And I was like, you only have 20 minutes. You're going to like rig the whole house.
It took her 10, because she talked to her mum 5 minutes, set up all these Home Alone booby traps 5 minutes, 10 minutes to fall asleep.
That's low-key how I am when I take melatonin too. Like I pop a melatonin or two and I'm like, okay, go. And like my nighttime routine is done.
I wanted to talk more about like, let's delve into the kind of why dreams are scary, blurring of reality versus, you know, dream, or subconscious versus consciousness. Also going back to that James Kendrick Razors in the Dreamscape article, that we're going to do a little bit of Freud. I'm going to read here. This difficulty in separating nightmare from reality recalls Freud's understanding of the uncanny, which is unheimlich, and the familiar, heimlich. Now, my German's not up to scratch, so if that's wrong, sorry about it. The terrible place of dreams is unheimlich, but dreams always start out heimlich, that is, in familiar terms. Thus, there are always a few moments at the beginning of each nightmare sequence when the viewer is forced to ask, is this dream or reality? Did Nancy go to sleep or is she still awake? These nightmares usually commence in the place where the victim goes to sleep, i.e. in Nancy's bedroom and the bathtub, and then slowly become weird or uncanny, thus signifying that the border has been crossed. However, the very fact that this border crossing remains questionable for any length of time suggests just how thin the border really is. Just as the permeability of inside/outside confounds the identificatory separation of Freddie and Nancy, so is unheimlich and heimlich difficult to separate, which complicates another theorist, Vera Dika's assertion in Game of Terror that the characters in a stalker film, and arguably of other genre products, form a distinctive set of binary oppositions. And so this critic goes on to talk about how, contrary to like other critics who maybe say that there's like a difference between like the killer, like you're meant to identify with the killer when you're watching horror films, a way of doing that is through that like iconic POV shot, and a lot of slashers have that POV shot. So the idea is that you're meant to be like the killer who's killing women, and that's why there's like sexist roots to slasher films. In contrast, Nightmare on Elm Street doesn't really have too many of those shots. Apparently there's only like 2 or 3 shots in the entirety of the film. He says that the film's overall visual strategy relies more on objective, detached camera work that emphasizes the openness of the dreamscape rather than a focused, singular perspective. Basically, there's not a straightforward thing of like we're identifying with the killer and then attacking the woman or anything like that. In fact, the identification, Kendrick goes on to argue, is very blurred inherently because we're actually in Nancy's subconscious. So in essence, Freddie's an extension of Nancy, right? Like there's not that easy separation here. So Kendrick says, with the lack of subjective camera shots from Freddie's point of view and his physical fragmentation by quick cuts and suggestions of his presence, he is rendered fully abject. Like birth and uterine imagery, Freddie's abject status, in Julia Kristeva's sense of the word, plays with inside-outside distinctions. As Barbara Creed, Kendrick's quoting our queen, notes, the concept of inside-outside suggests 2 surfaces that fold in on each other. The task of separating inside from outside seems impossible, as each surface contributes to the other side of its opposite. The implication is that the abject can never be fully banished, end quote of his Barbara Creed. Kendrick goes on to say, although in slasher films, killers and heroines share certain gender traits and an ability to utilize violence, they are still separate entities. The same cannot be said so easily of the killer and heroine in Nightmare on Elm Street, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to shift identification between Freddie and Nancy, because he is inside Nancy's subconscious. He is the inside of her outside, the interiority to her exteriority. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I like that they link in, Kendrick, this critic, links in Barbara Creed, because I think we can then tie that to what we know about the monstrous feminine more broadly. And we kind of know that women's bodies in horror are kind of treated as more permeable or like open to sin. And it's because of this, of Creed's like reading of Julia Kristeva's work of abjection, which is anything that is abject, quote, does not respect borders, positions, or rules, that which disrupts identity, systems, and order. And lots of horror is generated from the monstrous feminine, which has to do with abject things like corpses, blood, vomit, fluids. Like all these things remind us of like the fact that we're animalistic. There's kind of a collapse of subject, object, or human and inhuman distinction. And women are just seen as being closer to that, partly because some women menstruate and give birth, and it just puts like the female body in line with like nature more, rather than like something that is seen as like clean, symbolic order, law of the father, like the clean, perfect body, which is more human in like the kind of idealized eyes. But anyway, if you add that with something Carol Clover says in Men, Women, and Chainsaws, she notes that the word vulva itself is related to valve, like the root, which is gate or entry to the body. So it serves often as like a symbolic entry point for like sin or evil, I guess. And I think they play with that in this film in particular because we have the iconic like hand coming out of the bathtub scene, and there's a simultaneous like threat of assault, but also like, is it coming from inside of her? It almost looks like, with the camera work. All that to say is that this film, by playing with this collapse of dreams and reality and subconscious and unconscious, it collapses our like understanding of inside, outside, self, other dynamics, all in a really symbolic way.
If I'm being honest, I don't think I locate a lot of like uncanniness in the film or even objection. I think it is like very obviously meant to be repulsive at certain points, like when he's, you know, has sort of like oozing weird green gunk coming from him. To be honest, I don't think like the source of fear in the film doesn't seem to me that like more psychoanalytic, deep-rooted subconscious stuff. It seems a bit more obvious in certain films. Like I know that obviously like if something's symbolic, you can give it too much or too little sort of like weight in terms of how audience receives it. But I don't know, I think that in a really strange way, like it being already about dreams and nightmares, which are a space that's for the subconscious, I think that why we fear them is therefore so obvious, because it's like, it's so external, it's so like overt. It cancels out like that subtler Freudian kind of sources of fear. Like when I'm watching this film, I don't think there's like another level. And that's not a criticism of the film. And that's not to discount like the critics and the source material that like do apply Freud's theories or Kristeva's theory of objection to it. But like me personally watching it compared to other films we've done, it feels like a pretty head-on approach, or not even approach, because like intention is obviously always different from like how an audience receives it and experiences it. And I just think that like it feels like horror in quite a pure form. And I guess you could say there's always like another level, and there's always a subconscious kind of reaction that you're not necessarily tuned into. But I don't know, I'm not sure if I feel like it is so much about like that sort of collapsing of selfhood that you talked about. And that's obviously just like a personal thing, that when I was watching it, I didn't feel like any of that. I don't know if it like evoked similar uncanniness than other films have, which I think is like why I enjoyed it more. I don't think it complicated itself too much.
I mean, it's just uncanny in the way that like all dreams are uncanny. I think it's uncanny. It's not uncanny in the sense that we've had like doppelganger, which is like, you know, an obvious uncanny. It's more of like, we're in Nancy's bathtub, and just kidding, we're in Nancy's dream bathtub. Like, it's just, that's the uncanny, really.
I see the uncanny, but I'm not going to give it credit on purpose, because I think I agree with Louisa, your assessment that dreams are inherently uncanny. So everything that's going to happen in a dream is based on somebody's subconscious fear. And I think especially in these like 80s soon to be franchisey horror films, like it's just a grab bag, especially in like when you're having a nightmare. Sometimes it's just like a grab bag of things that are like unsettling, and you're not necessarily going to put your finger on why. I do always think that having a woman as the protagonist turns on a part of my subconscious fears that is different, right? Like I genuinely don't understand when men are like, oh, I'm not, like they're like, oh, I'm not afraid of a home invader, or I'm not afraid of walking alone at night. Like they just don't have those subconscious fears. So I'm sitting here being like, well, wouldn't anybody sleep with a bat by their bed? The answer is no. So people are really just like not afraid of those things. And I guess there's like these like doofy kind of, I forget, it's fucking Johnny Depp in this, but there's like these doofy boys in this movie who they serve the purpose of, I guess, not believing her or acting like she's going to them for protection. She's like, please, can you just like stay awake while I sleep? Or like, I don't know, she's putting them in these like roles. And even though they're sharing the dreams, they're having the same dreams of Freddy Krueger, like it takes them a really long time to even consider that it might be real or something to like be concerned about. Like they're just unconcerned for a little bit longer. And so with that in mind, I guess I can give it like, okay, like obviously there's knives, there's like the penetration thing, we've done this, we've talked about this, like there are those scenes where like it makes a difference about who is getting stabbed. The dynamics are just like a bit different. But I will say in the other films that we're going to, this is what I wanted to say, in the other films that we're going to cover, like I feel like there's less well, Last Night in Soho is like all about subconscious, blah, 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 blah. How's it going to manifest? But like with Malignant, it's such a specific thing that's going on. Like it's not a subconscious fear that we all have. So I think there's like, I can't just say all movies where dreams or hallucinations are at the center of it are just like inherently playing off of subconscious fears. Like there has to be like a little bit of intent to it. But I think because a nightmare, your own human nightmares are kind of like a grab bag, and sometimes you wake up and you don't even know why they're scary. You're like, I wouldn't be scared of this in real life. Like, why was it so scary in a dream? Like, I had a dream that Kathy Bates was chasing me around Bowser's castle. I have no fear of that happening in real life. So I could see both sides of it. Like, it feels like a gray area in this instance, but I do think having a woman at the center does make a difference to like the uncanny, the da-da-da. Like, I don't think it's a womb. I don't think the whole thing's a womb metaphor. Not everything can be Toombad, unfortunately, but there's something to it.
Yeah, I think gender is significant in this, and a reason I brought it in as like women as abject, women's bodies as more permeable or whatever, is because I think the film's playing with like Nancy's chastity or her kind of reservedness when it comes to like sex and her kind of like standoffishness. And, you know, with the whole, like we mentioned, the tongue phone, I'm your boyfriend now. Like she says she doesn't have sex with Glenn. And the fact that like we have a typical slasher formula here, which is like Tina and Rod have sex. Tina dies first. Of course, she's the woman. Rod dies next. And then I also think, I mean, I think it's implied that she's a virgin, right? Because she's like clutching the cross in bed. Like she might also just be like scared. But I think the fact that she kind of abstains, either way, we don't see her have sex in this film. So she has abstained in this thing. And we know, like, when we talk about the monstrous feminine, Carol Clover says the final girl usually is like asexual or in some way, or like masculinized maybe. I don't know about applying like that formula to like every final girl. I really respect like Men, Women, and Chainsaws for all like the individual specific points and the overarching intellectual endeavor to talk about like why a woman survives and how like male audiences might identify more if the woman's masculinized. Like I think that's interesting. I'm utterly uninterested in like the whole bunch of criticism that comes next, which just is like, she's a great final girl, she's a terrible final girl, she's a masculine final girl, she's a feminine final girl. I'm like, that's boring. I don't know. I just find that uninteresting to me. Anyway, that's a tangent just to say that. And yeah, we're talking about like, this is a movie that's largely like Nancy's almost like menaced kind of sexuality via Freddie, who's like making fun of it. And we know from like original like versions of the script that he was a child molester, and due to like some scandals at the time involving like sexual abuse of young children, they changed the script last minute to child murderer. And when you look at it in the framework of like molester, because it doesn't really make sense that Freddy Krueger murdered 20 kids and somehow didn't get arrested and like parents had to be like vigilante. Whereas if you look at it as like he molested 20 kids, which is like harder to prove, and like why the parents are so sketchy and like ashamed of talking about everything, then it becomes a lot more clear that this was a film kind of about his kind of perversion and whatnot. All that to say, if you're kind of looking at Freddy as like in Nancy's subconscious, then he's also like an extension of Nancy. It's kind of like symbolizing her almost repressed or unexpressed sexuality as is now being realized through this like ultimate sin child pervert person who's like invading her dreams. And there's just like boundary of like, is she being in her subconscious being like metaphorically assaulted, or is it coming from her because it's like all her dream anyway, and ultimately she decides that she can take away his power. It's all kind of blurry and murky, and I think that like hand coming out vagina scene is like playing with that or drawing attention to that.
I've been thinking about that. I felt like I was in that water with her.
It's simultaneously showing like her kind of being attacked by Freddy, but also like maybe coming from her. It's an ambiguous camera angle. And the fact that she's the daughter of the mother who in essence castrated Freddy, metaphorically. They killed him. Slashers in some ways, like lots of people think, or Creed thinks that slashers are like an ideological project to like help us confront castration anxiety as a society. And Freddy is like already a castrated figure, and like, you know how fingers losing limbs and stuff is like a kind of microcosm for like castration anxieties as a whole. And he like at one point in the film like cuts off his own finger in front of Tina, and it's like to say like the worst has already happened. Like it's kind of playing with like our castration anxieties. And yeah, if you're looking at her as Nancy as a virgin, and there's a lot of like castrate, according to Creed, like virgin for losing your virginity, if like the hymen tears and bleeds, like there's a lot of lore around a vagina dentata, and a kind of bleeding vagina relates to that and like perpetuates that like subconscious fear. We've talked about it in our episodes. It just becomes more interesting as like what this film has to say as a slasher about castration anxiety, basically, because if we have this kind of more virginal figure. And it's also interesting that like her boyfriend gets swallowed up by this like gigantic bloody blender hole. Is that like his kind of metaphorical castration too, if we're looking at Freddy as like Nancy's subconscious? It's, yeah, I don't know.
I feel like even if they switched his background from a child molester to a child murderer, I think it's something that's quite heavily implied. Even if it's just stated he's a child murderer, like these crimes are often sexual. Even so, we get the insinuation of it, but I'm not sure like how much people are tuned into that. Like even like if we're watching that iconic scene like of her in the bathtub, I wonder, obviously depends on like the audience member, but I think the castration anxiety that's like I think could be invoked quite strongly by his like claw knife fingers. I don't know how much like I was gonna say ickiness. That's like very subdued. What I mean is the sort of like grotesque insinuation of like him molesting her through these dreams, like obviously symbolically through these horrible like knife fingers. Like if that was played up a bit more, like in an overt way, I think that the film would have a completely different tone. And don't get me wrong, I think a lot of 80s films like have this sort of campy approach with like extremely dark context or like lore to them that I don't think people are like, I don't think they're really tuned in as much. And then I also don't know how much like that castration anxiety is like actually so prevalent to maybe in the 80s they're going around fucking terrified of, confrontations with the symbolic order. I think modern audiences watching these films where a lot of the imagery that we associate with the monstrous feminine, like castration anxiety, monstrous womb, I think that they have taken a completely different meaning to like a modern audience. I don't know how much of the like old scripture of like film analysis and film theory is like carrying on into like how we watch these films. It's not subverting any like horror imagery, and like we've all mentioned, like it plays on those sort of pointy, stabby, penetrative knives, gross green ooze that comes out of him, chopping off the fingers. Like it hits all those marks, kind of recycling some of those like, well, no, I mean, it like innovated obviously a lot of that imagery, but like recycling all of this visual language around the sort of Freudian undertones that we talk about, but then like kind of like taking a fun, campy twist to it so that like some of this meaning is kind of disjointed.
I mean, I'm looking at this reading like critics who have like thought about it from like what horror means as a collective fear in society. I'm not really necessarily watching it thinking that consciously. I mean, actually, well, we do this a lot, so I actually am. Now I'm like too self-conscious going into things, but like I'm like, ooh, there's castration anxiety. But I mean, like, obviously, I think this is more like sub-level, right? Like, I don't, in the same way that like you have to look at every horror movie as a product of its moment, I'm more looking at it as like a product of its moment in the 80s rather than how modern viewers would interpret it like us. Like I agree that I don't think that we carry over necessarily always the same anxieties, and if we do, it's depicted in different ways now. I think it's also interesting like the kind of repressed sexual consciousness or something of Nancy or something when you look at the next Nightmare on Elm Street, which we did talk about already, and that was like right in the middle of like the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and then we can kind of see how Freddy becomes a really queer fear and like that invasion of like the main character who's male.
But even that they said wasn't on purpose.
Oh, I don't think these things are on purpose. I think filmmakers make stuff and what they find scary says a lot about what society at that
or it's
time
like
thinks
the
is
most
scary.
subversive thing we've ever witnessed. They're like, actually, let's make his arms long and goofy so they won't notice that we're talking about castration anxiety. Or like, I have to go back and listen to our sequel episode, but like the casting of that man in Nightmare on Elm Street 2, it's like They swear down that that character is straight. And he even, like, there's nothing, if I were to read the script, I'd be like, yeah, that's a straight character. And then you cast an obviously gay man in the middle of the AIDS crisis. And then I'm like, I'm just supposed to accept that, like, anything I read into it is coincidental. I have to give, like, one inkling of, there has to be some intention behind these decisions, especially because we refer to this movie when we're referring to, like, instances of movies that have castration anxiety later on. We're like, oh, it's like Freddy's knife fingers. I don't know if it's, like, retroactively saying that, like, oh, this was the thing, that this is the blueprint. I have to give credit to, like, what people took away from it. Like, whether or not they intended to have all these things going on, that is how people read this movie and have read this movie. And all of its children that it has spawned, not just sequels, but just, like, movies that, like, pay homage to it. They are doing it on purpose. So whether this movie does it or not, like, it's something has occurred, so I have to analyze it that way. Like, it's a beast beyond the creator's making.
Death of the author.
I do think the script is a little bit, we talked about, for Nightmare on Elm Street 2, we talked about that script having, like, some very, like, obvious queer metaphor. Jesse, the main character who's being attacked by Freddy, he's like, there's something inside of me. Something is trying to get inside my body. He's inside me. I'm scared. He's inside me and he wants to take me again. Like, come on.
Normally it takes them a few goes to get into these, like, deeply queer subtexts. Like, they jump straight to it.
It says something that, like, in the next film, we have, like, something that is a very, like, I think, if you're retrospectively looking at it, but how could they not have infused it, even if it was subconscious, this, like, sexual undertones to the film. So I do think we see that with Nancy too. Like, if in the next film Freddy is, like, a repressed sexuality, then I think he's also a repressed sexuality in this film. And yeah, I just think it's interesting that, like, you know, Johnny Depp's character Glenn gets, like, blended in the bed, like, in this, like, mysterious bloody hole, when metaphorically, like, Nancy doesn't have sex with him and, like, was potentially, like, I think it is kind of symbolically showing Nancy's castrating potential. If we're looking at this from a Barbara Creed sense, Mila, which is our whole podcast endeavor,
I didn't say anything.
I can see your face getting ready to argue with me.
I wasn't going to argue. I was simply going to just posit the idea that there's, like, only a few shapes that things can be.
He could have been sliced. Like, he could have been, but he, like, falls into a bloody hole is what's significant. Whereas Tina's, like, sliced out. It's just interesting that her boyfriend, Nancy's boyfriend, dies that way in comparison to everyone else who is, like, more, you know, they don't fall in anything. They just, you can see them dying externally. One critic said something interesting. Kara Shimabukuro in The Boogeyman of Your Nightmares, Freddy Krueger's folkloric roots, interestingly talks about this film as a kind of folklore or folk horror. And I think that's interesting given that we've been doing folk horror a lot. And their rationale for this is that he's often referred to, Freddy that is, as, like, the boogeyman, and the boogeyman in, like, culture, they say, he harks back to deals made with the devil in grim stories, and the children were inadvertently traded to Krueger through the past actions of parents. And apparently that's kind of common in, like, boogeyman lore around the world, or folklore. The boogeyman as a seducer is seen in references to the Pied Piper of Hamelin, and as Krueger punishes the parents of the town through their children, Krueger as a boogeyman character is also supported by his only existing in a strictly supernatural world of the dreamscape and the character's ultimate failure to destroy him. And I thought this was an interesting read of, like, a potential American folk horror canon edition. They also look at slasher films as they become, this critic looks at slasher films as, like, a kind of wider, almost folkloric enterprise, because as they become franchises, they become lore that we repeat to ourselves, like, in society in, like, almost a meta way. They talk about these slasher films as, like, creating, like, word of mouth killers, and, like, as horror movies as our kind of modern way of, like, writing folklore that then permeates more on a global level. And I thought that was interesting addition, seeing this, all the conversations we've been having about folk horror recently.
I feel like that's, like, an element of folk horror. I mean, we obviously touched on in terms of, like, the inner community. Like, the suburbs is, like, those little pockets of community.
Yeah, I think the most slippery point of folk horror was the rural landscape, right? Like, we realized, especially, we can have it in different It just means a connection to the land. And we certainly have the parents here have a deep connection to this sense of place. They all share a secret of having killed some guy out of like retribution.
And I think the villains in these franchises get so abstracted, like the lore gets so complicated that we forget what they even, like what their origin is. Because I'm just thinking about how many elementary schoolers dress up as Freddy Krueger for Halloween, and he's a fucking child molester. It is very strange, but I assume a lot of them like haven't seen the movie, or if they did, they didn't really get it. Or if they have, they've seen like the many sequels, and like I don't know, I remember watching franchise horror at that age and like genuinely like feeling thoroughly confused. Like I know he's scary, but I couldn't tell you exactly why. Like I know he gets in dreams, I know he can kill you and you die in real life, but that's all I understood about these movies as a kid. And I think that's the same with like Freddy. It's the same with like all the like faceless sort of supernatural killers. Like I do love the folklore of it, because I remember as a kid, like we would tell stories about these villains having not understood the movies. Like it was all of our sleepover stories, it was all of our like recess like things we'd say to like fuck with each other, and like it becomes its own like thing. I love that. But like for the people who are really into the franchises and know everything, I'm like, what's the fucking point of knowing everything? Because like I feel like at some point the origin story doesn't even matter. Like, and that's the fun of folklore as well.
Yeah, folk horror as a self-aware, self-making genre. Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Feminine podcast, produced and hosted by Zeba Aurora, Tyia Burnett, Mila F., and Louisa Johnson. Big thanks also go to Sebastian Pizarro for our wonderful theme music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at the MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on TikTok at the Monstrous Feminine Pod for podcast clips and more fun. All information can be found on our website, www.themonstrousfemininepodcast.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Brooms up, witches out.